So, Ron, here's an invitation, okay? I would like to offer you this invitation. Up here. Oh. Yeah, well, she may be.
Oh, excellent.
Here's the invitation. I would like you to read the invitation, since it's your invitation, and then carry on from there.
You are invited by the King of Kings to choose someone in the fellowship. Shake their hand and say, "Have a blessed day."
Okay.
Do it.
Oh.
No, I just offered you the invitation. You do whatever you want. Okay. All right. Thank you, Ron, for that lesson. You're going to find... Oh, you're actually going... Yeah. Oh, okay. Repentance. Yeah, repentance. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Ron. You actually carried that in both directions, because the lesson goes unwittingly. But here's the question to you. An invitation. Ron had two key decisions to make there. Can anyone tell me what those two decisions were? Simple as that, right, Pam? Christianity is simple as that. In comes the invitation. Ron could have sat there and pretended I was talking to someone else, which he did at first until Carol poked him in the arm. And then he caught that an invitation to him. Ron, I have an invitation. At that point, Ron had a decision to make. He could come up, he could ignore it, whatever. So luckily, for the sake of the illustration, Ron did come up. And so he made that decision. And then he read it, and it was revealed to him. He had no idea, because I didn't tell him in advance what that invitation was to or for. He read it, and then comes this big decision. He can either act on the invitation, or he can, as he did, ignore the invitation at first and sat down. That he was perfectly within his right to do that. And then, of course, Ron repented, and he went off and shook Brenda's hand. So he covered both bases in doing this. This is how this works with God. God offers an invitation, and you can ignore it. You cannot be in the relationship. That's one thing with Ron. If you noticed at the beginning, I said, I've been picking on you all this series. There was our relationship. I was using Ron. So here's an invitation to somebody that I knew in this relationship. He came up. So it started with relationship. There was an invitation, because the invitation becomes part of the relationship. With God, he would even say, as we look in the Blackaby study, the relationship and the invitation are indivisible. If you're in a relationship with God, you will be brought in an invitation. And the invitation will be in some way for God working and wants to work you to join him. Ron opened up and he read. It was revealed to him. God reveals to you and I what that invitation is all about once we accept it and acknowledge it. And then we're going to end up in the step here where we are called crisis of belief. First thing on those decisions, though, the first decision in the invitation revolves around how God feels about you. The second decision revolves around how you feel about God. God offers you an invitation. He is thinking that for some reason you can carry out what he's inviting you to join in. We're going to define what that means, how he believes in you in a moment. The second one is how you believe in God. Because chances are it'll be something you can't do on your own. And God will be, either you believe, if you believe in God, great. But do you believe enough to act on what God tells you? And that will tell what you really believe, no matter what you say. So we have these two decisions. We have the invitation. We have this thing called crisis of belief, as Blackaby would term it. What is he saying here? How does that work into it? Well, first, with this word crisis, the way we use it today wasn't the way it was originally created in the Greek language. The word crisis in the Greek language really meant a decision that was based on a judgment or testing or trial or something. If we were to use crisis maybe in their way, it might be like this. You decide to buy a new car. You go down, you check this dealer, and you check that dealer, and you check this model, and you check that model, and you take all this evidence, you weigh it in your head, and then you decide which car you're going to buy. Well, it's a decision in that way. It's a very heavy decision. So here's the invitation. Is this God really speaking? God wants me to do this. Will I really decide to carry this out? It's a crisis in just the decision of how much you really believe in God. In your relationship, is that relationship real enough? Is that relationship strong enough that you will act on what God invites you to join Him in? But we run into some problems sometimes, because this is where Christians, we start getting things mixed up. See, we don't seem to be able to distinguish easily between working for God and working in God. We tend to want to do the for God thing where it's, God directs me. Like once I told Ron, this is where the analogy, the illustration breaks down. I didn't have to carry Ron over to Brenda so he could shake her hand and lift his arm up and give him the power. He just went off and did. He decided he went off and followed the instruction under his own steam, which we would expect with a simple illustration like this. But when God invites you to do something, let me pull back and ask a question. This is all about joining God where He works. Now, when God is God working in God-sized things or in man-sized things? Does God work in God-sized things or man-sized things? He's God. Even logic would dictate He's working in God-sized things. But you know what that means? When you join Him, you're asked to join in a God-sized thing. Something that is probably beyond what you or I can do. In John 5:19, Jesus brings us a little bit of this model. Jesus answering them said, "Most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of Himself but what He sees the Father do." The Son can do nothing of Himself but what He sees the Father do. In this, so far in His statement, it goes this far. So you don't even know what to do that's godly. That comes from God. And then comes the second part of the statement. For whatever He does, the Son does in like manner. So not only do you and I get called and invited in to do the God thing, we have to do it God's way. And if we fail at either one, we fail at the invitation. We fail at the task. We fail at the journey to which we are called. That means the ends doesn't justify the means. It is as important to do a godly thing God's way as it is to do it at all. So we have to keep this in mind. Why? Because the pastor said so? No. This is straight out of the mouth of Jesus saying this in this invitation. And in working in God, it's the only way it'll happen. You can work for God, but then it's just all human. And the thing is, you might do some wonderful stuff. And you might be really busy, and people will go, "Oh, wow, look at all they're doing for God." And God says, "Yeah, that's really nice, but so what?" The difference between for God and in God is this, is that eternal things happen when it's in God. We could have this church service, and this could be for God. And we'll all leave this place and forget that we were ever here. However, if it is worship in God, then eternal things happen. All of a sudden, don't know why, it doesn't seem to be all that different, but people are changing. See, you and I can't save anyone. You and I can't transform even ourselves. We can try and change, but we can't transform ourselves. Only God can do that. We can be invited to join, but we can't do it in ourselves. If you look through Scripture, and if you take this into account, God working in the world, there seems to be two broad characters or categories in which we can find God working. And the crisis of belief comes into both, because we'll find out as we look at them that in both cases it's impossible for you or I to do this on our own. That God comes in or it ain't happening. It doesn't happen. The first we'll call the huge work. And we've looked at a number of these already through this series. If you look at, we looked at Moses. When he led the Israelite people out to the promised land, everything happened that was impossible. They were in captivity to a superpower. Nobody could deliver them except God. We look at Joshua. Joshua goes in and conquers a land that would have been impossible for them to conquer. Sarah and Abraham, an impossible birth. Even the New Testament, look at Peter and Paul healing people in the book of Acts from impossible sicknesses. That medical type of miracles doesn't even really happen in our day. So we see lots of these huge works God's doing, but we're going to look at somebody else today that we haven't talked about yet, and someone we find in Judges 6, and very unassuming hero by the name of Gideon. And we're going to look at this guy. Now let's back up. I want you to get the full flavor of this so we get the full meaning. Israel at this time, 3,200 years ago, they've fallen away from the God they followed. They're no longer even a centralized power. Everybody just broke up into clans, like cliques in a church. So they're in this situation where they're extremely vulnerable to the enemy. At this time, the Midianites and the Amalekites are the ones that are on their border. And it was said that they would come in countless numbers. And they had a kind of a cavalry because they'd come in on camels. And I imagine that must have been just some sight standing there watching thousands of camels and people with swords coming at you. Pretty scary stuff. They had a particular way that they were subjugating or trying to subjugate the people of Israel. What they would do, they'd wait until they've got their crops planted, maybe wait until they come up a little bit, maybe wait for the harvest. They'd wait, and then they'd come in these countless waves, and they'd decimate the produce. And they decimate any livestock they could get hold of. I was leaving here the other day, and I saw Kevin out there in the field, and he's out there in the middle of the night. I don't know how many hours of sleep you get at this time of year, Kevin. What, like 2? There he is out there working away. Just imagine if we were all in Kevin's occupation there, growing crops. We work all seasons, all through, get all these crops, getting ready to do it, and then this wave of enemy comes in and just decimates every single strand of produce we have. And then they do it again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. You're getting the picture. This was impossibly desperate times. The only food that Israel had was a little bit that they were able to hide away somewhere. It was a really desperate situation. And God does something then that he still does now. And he didn't just come in and deliver them. He sent a prophet. He sent a message in a way just before the invitation. And he reminded them, hey, you're in an impossible situation. But remember when you were in that impossible situation before. Remember when you were in Egypt and I delivered you out? Well, guess what? I'm about to do it again. God does that. He said, he starts up by reminding you of what he's already done, because he has done something already in every life. So he reminds them of this. Then we come to our very unlikely hero in this story, is this servant, this man named Gideon. And the story opens with us with Gideon. Here he is threshing wheat in a wine press. And the Bible makes a point and it mentions it. And in our day, we're going, okay, so what? Well, let me bring us into that. If you look at the situation, here's how this works. Top is a wine press. A wine press can be so small that you can have it in a building. It's not very big, so you can have it in a building that crushes the grapes, and you know how that works. A threshing floor for grain was quite different. They're still, in some parts of the world, done this very way. A great big floor, threshing floor, out in the open, not in a building, out in the open. It's very important it's in the open, because as you grind the grain, the wind helps you out and it blows away the husk, the things you don't want. And so the wind does half the work for you over a big surface. You have lots of grain, you got to grind a lot of it to get the grain. However, wine was a different story. You press just a certain amount of grapes at a time. So here is this young fellow, Gideon. This is presented as this young man. He's in a wine press, probably in a building, something like that one up there, and he's threshing wheat in a wine press. That's a lot like scrubbing your floor with a toothbrush. It's the wrong tool, and you can't get very much at a time. Why is he doing this? Well, one reason: desperation, fear. If he were out on that big field with a threshing floor, the Amalekites would see him there. They come over, take his grain, and kill him. So out of fear of his enemies, he's hiding out in a wine press, just getting as much grain as he can to eat. So the whole picture we get of this is not some big dude here who's fearless. It is a man operating in desperation and fear, which makes it really funny, because this would take us up to Judges 6:11, and by verse 12, this angel, or the Lord, comes, and it says this: "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him," that is Gideon, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." What? Is he being sarcastic or what? Here he is calling him this mighty man of valor while he's desperately hiding out from his enemies, trying to get a couple of grains of wheat so he can eat. How is this a mighty man of valor? Well, it's obviously not to do with what he is. It must be something else, because the angel isn't being sarcastic and he's not lying. So how does this work? Well, we get a hint as this goes on, because there's an invitation we know is given. We all know the story from childhood with Gideon and what's about to happen with the enemy. So the angel, Gideon makes a comment to the angel. He's given the invitation, which is going to be to save Israel. And now he's at this crisis we're talking about. Now Gideon has this invitation. The angel has just read it to him. Now comes the crisis of belief. What will he do? Well, he starts to respond from the way he sees things in the perspective. Gideon says to this angel, "O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." So I am the weakest of the least. How am I supposed to save? Well, what will the angel respond? How would God respond? He's going to build him up. He's going to affirm him for the task. But is he going to say, Gideon, there's a lot more in you than you know. Let's just build up that self-esteem in you, Gideon. No, this is the affirmation he receives. And the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you. Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." He is going to win, but it's not out of his own expertise or valor. The valor he does have is not in his own character so much, but in the relationship. There is something God believes that in this relationship, he can give this invitation to Gideon, and he's going to follow through in his faith. He's going to follow through with God. So he gets this far. You want the affirmation, you're going to pull us off, Gideon, not because you're a great guy, but because I'm with you. Wow, that's a lot of, boy, if we could just learn that. If we could just learn that. Then Gideon does, here it comes, because 3,000 years plus later, and we still do it the same way. Then Gideon says to this angel, "If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talks to me." Isn't that the way we do Christianity today? God might be saying, give me a sign. We still look for signs. But God's patient, and first, he really gives 3 signs. First, he burns up miraculously the offering. Then there's the fleece thing. Man, we still use that today, but, well, let's lay out the fleece, right? As if that's like biblical protocol. And God has patience. Yep. So he goes ahead and he makes the fleece wet when the ground's dry and dry when the ground's wet. And he goes, so eventually Gideon gets in there and he understands, okay, must be God working. Let's follow. So he's back in with the relationship. He has, through his crisis of belief, in his decision, in his belief, decided he's not just giving lip service to God anymore. He's getting off his touche and onto his feet, and he's going to act on the invitation. Wow, well, good for you, Gideon. And it looks pretty good at first when you think of it. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many for me. Well, how can you have too many? Countless enemy. And if essentially there were over 30,000 men who responded to this call to go to war. Maybe there was twice that many of the enemy, but there have been battles where people have won when the strategy was right at 2-1 or even 3-1. But God says, no, you guys strayed so far, I got to get a really clear message out here. So he says this, the people who are with you are too many for me. Why? To give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. Imagine if you're going into life and death, and you just lost 2/3 of your force. They might have stood a chance, 10,000, starting to look pretty dicey, but it's still not enough for God to get his message across, so we know he whittles it down, and so we go from 30,000 eventually down to 300. Let's just knock off a couple of zeros on that number. And then, as we know that we reach this point here is where they are solidly, where God's going to make this happen or it ain't happening, right? Thousands and thousands of the enemy, 300. I don't even think the Navy SEALs would like those odds, would they? Those are some pretty bad odds going on. And so as we know the story, it goes on that in the middle of the night, they've got 300 guys with torches, and they've got the pots over the torches and the sword in one hand. They surround the camp. 300, they must have been really spread out for just 300 guys to surround this big camp. They break the pots, hold up the torches, and then wave their sword in the other hand and say, for the Lord and Gideon, and they shout this out. Well, in normal thinking, what would happen? Well, these 30,000 plus enemy guys would look and say, well, we better attack. They find out there's only 300 of them, and then they have a good laugh as they slaughter them all, right? But instead, something else happens. God sends a confusion over this camp where they are so terrified by something, they don't even know what. 300 guys with torches, they start killing each other. Oh, you must be the enemy. And there's chaos in this camp to the point where in the middle of the night, they just run away. They run back home, whoever's left alive. Just imagine if God would have told Gideon in advance on that, huh? Is that, you've got 300 guys. You're going to take on these thousands of men, and not one of you will even end up with a scratch. As a matter of fact, you won't even break a sweat. How can that happen? Pretty huge. God inviting them into an impossible work that only he could do. What was Gideon's big plus in this, the big valor that we were speaking of? It wasn't Gideon and what he could do. It was one simple thing, following God to the end. Joining him in this work. Gideon wasn't doing it, God was doing it. Gideon was just going to be the face, just the human element, just a part of this. Well, does God still work like that? I mean, here we are in this little church. I don't think we're being called to surround anybody and wave swords at them, at least not that I know of. But God still works. Marilee, you always come up with something. You're just trying to break me up, aren't you? I'm going to, a Blackaby story. Here's a Blackaby story for you. All this series has been from the learnings of the experiences and the insights from Henry Blackaby. Henry Blackaby started in and of course we're not worshiping Henry Blackaby, he's just a man on whom God's worked through, and there's some insights for us to gather from a brother here. And in this little church that he started up in the prairie of Saskatchewan, up near Saskatoon, he had this little church, probably smaller than ours, and he had been teaching the stuff we're looking at over and over. It was part of the fabric of the church. So this story goes like this. The finance committee for this church, under this teaching, as we look at it, the big things God does, comes to the pastor and they say, you know, we're looking at changing the way we're doing our budget. And okay, here we go. Budgets, the only thing that's more scary than war is budgets, right? So here are these people who show up and they say, you know, Pastor, with all this teaching, the way we understand God's the one who's doing all this, and we looked at the way we do our budget, and basically they did it like everyone else does a budget. Here's what we have. This is what we can do with what we have. And he said the problem that's really been getting under our skin with this is that it doesn't reflect really God will do anything. It's all about what we can do. So we came up with a new method based on this. We all get into this relationship like you're talking about. We all look to see, convinced where God is inviting us to work. Not his work, but where he is working. And we join him. And then we do this with our budget. It has nothing to do with numbers. It has to do with what God's doing. Then we divide the budget into three parts. One is what we can do through the tithes that we regularly have. Two, what we can do through the finances that have been promised to us. And then three, all depends on God. All depends on God. So this committee got together. They really bathed it in prayer. They looked at everything they could, and they put together what they thought God was trying to do through this place. Now keep in mind, we've looked a little at the history of what they did up there. The big legacy of Blackaby up in this area was in the prairie up there. There was very few of Baptist churches. He was a Baptist minister in the towns around him. Even though there were many people praying that somebody would build a church in their little town. And eventually, I think 200 or so they had built all around the area. So God was using them in some big ways eventually. That's their legacy. As a matter of fact, you and I here, we're actually even part of the legacy because we're going through the study that ultimately he collated all of this together. But anyway, it starts way back then with this little town. Their budget was, as they usually did it, was $64,000 for the year. Sounds about right for a little church. What they determined God wanted to do with them would cost them $164,000. So they went ahead and they did what they thought they were supposed to do. Their budget by the end of that year had turned out to be $172,000. Where did that money come from? Same place Gideon's victory came from. There was a point that only a God who could do God-sized work came into this whole picture. Not what we can do, but what he can do. We just have to make darn sure we're doing what he wants done. We are joining him, not asking him to join us. Takes us back to the relationship. In this first category, it's huge work. God inviting you into huge work. And there's a blessing and a challenge and an accomplishment that kind of goes with it. The blessing is obvious. If God invites you and me into this huge work, and we actually see something happen, then our faith is affirmed. We'll be at a whole other level of faith by the time this is done. not only that, there will be something incredible that will be done. Even think of Gideon. The real accomplishment wasn't that he won that impossible battle. The real accomplishment is that the lineage for Christ remained set up. The Messiah would eventually come through that victory. That was part of the chain. So it was something far bigger than they could even know. Same thing with this Baptist church. Here we are. They don't know us. And we're one of countless churches who, of course, done this study over time. Here's the thing, the challenge of it, you don't attempt it unless you're into a very solid relationship with God. You've got to make real sure it's God who's telling you to do what there is to do. That takes a little bit of growth going on. Thing to remember is God doesn't start by asking you to go out and defeat an army of countless numbers. But the challenge is you need to be in a big relationship to make this happen. And of course, then the real accomplishment is far greater than even the victory at the time. Like it was for Gideon, like it was for Blackaby, it's the same. That's the broad category of the huge work. But God doesn't always work in these huge Gideon-sized work. The other work is just as impossible, but it may not seem quite that huge. Well, any biblical examples? Well, let me take you into an example. This one's quite different. It's in the early part of the relationship between the apostles and Jesus. And we're going to call this the work in the everyday. Not God in the work of the huge, but God in the work of the everyday. The story in Luke 5 goes like this. Now, when he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, that is Peter, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." Just live in this moment for it. Anybody ever cast nets? You know, they had little rocks on the sides and they throw them over the side of the boat, you know. Imagine doing that all night. You know, I presented that to Larry, and so Larry hasn't even tried that, you know. So here they are, over and over. Can you imagine what you would feel like if you did that all night by the next morning? The last thing you would want to do is this again. Keep in mind the situation. Jesus is a carpenter. Now, if they only see him as a carpenter, who is he to tell them? That's their job. They do this for a living. They know how to catch fish. And even with all their expertise in the right water at the right time, there was a technique they did it at night, they caught nothing for all their expertise. Now here's their crisis of faith. It's small compared to Gideon, but it's still very significant, is throw the net one more time. Just do what you know, but go where I tell you and throw the net one more time. If Jesus is just a carpenter, it's like, yeah, right, Jesus, let us teach you about fishing later. We're going home for a rest. Or he actually is the Lord, and they follow with what he would say. Well, in their crisis, what they do is they do throw the net. And it's funny, when Ron first sat down, I was thinking of this. And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish. It was phenomenal what happened when they followed through. And it was kind of like, what if they would have been Ron number one when he just went and sat down and didn't do anything? They would have missed this. It wouldn't have happened. And their nets were filled to breaking, so they signaled the partners in the other boat to come and help them, and then call them and both boats, so that they filled them so much they began to sink. And interesting, Simon Peter has a reaction to this. It's not, we don't have to work for the rest of the year. Look at all this fish. Isn't this great? And his reaction's interesting. He goes and falls down at the knees of Jesus, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Wow. This whole experience, the reaction was something different. Just want to point out, Jesus is now working in their everyday life. Every day to ad nauseum. We fished all night. We don't want to be fishing anymore. We want to go home. This is our job, but we're done. We couldn't get it done today. And then comes an inconvenient invitation. You know what you were just doing? Go out and do it one more time. What? Go out and do it one more time. Go where I tell you and just do your job. And so there it goes. They go out one more time, and what happens is phenomenal. What was the message in all of this? What was Jesus getting across? Well, the big lesson was in this crisis of belief. It starts with this, is that it doesn't have to be the huge thing. God's working can be in what we might consider the mundane, the everyday thing. See, when God does something in the huge, he is showing us how powerful he is. But when God works in your mundane, in your everyday, he's showing you how powerfully invested he is in you. That even the small things, even what we might consider the small things, but keep in mind, the accomplishment was still impossible. There was Peter. They could have came away from that and said, we catch fish all the time. There's nothing new there. But they wouldn't have caught them that day. And they wouldn't have caught them that way. It was just as impossible, but yet it happened. Blessing, challenge, accomplishment. Blessing is that they see how powerfully invested he is in their life. But it goes beyond that. It's still something bigger. Think of where Peter is going to end up in life. At some point, he's no longer fishing, he's fishing men. He's leading a church. Do you think maybe the lessons from this came back? That God accomplishes things far bigger than you can, even when you have some expertise in the job. But the big challenge in this one, unlike the others, actually the opposite, is it's easy to dismiss. Maybe that was just coincidence. Maybe in our I'm going to steal from you, Marilee, from last night. We were doing our discussion group, one of the little stories, and if I get it wrong, sorry, you tell me later. Leading a Bible study somewhere and had to open the door of a clubhouse to get in. And tries with this key and can't get in the door, says a prayer, and click, it opens. Well, Marilee and you and I, we open doors with keys all the time. What's so surprising about that? Well, it's funny, it just wouldn't open until maybe the prayer. How many times maybe has something happened that, well, I do this all the time, but this time it was impossible. This time it was solely God, and somehow we miss it. We miss God working even in the simple things. It's quite a challenge to realize when it's God. It's still impossible. It's still impossible. It's just God pulls it off. The accomplishment is this, is that Peter is equipped now in one more way for what he's going to be called to do in the future. It's far more than his job got a windfall. I'm sure it was wonderful to have so many fish. But the real reaction to it was this. Peter realized who he was. Depart from me, I'm a sinful man. And he calls him Lord. He says, I know now more who I am, and I know more who you are, God. And that plays into his life. Learning from both of these big events, tiny events, the everyday, the impossibly huge, learning from them both, it's the same thing, is that what's going on is at some point there are two big decisions every one of us make, and sometimes we even make it as a group. First one is, will we take the invitation? Great, we do. Second one is, well, do we believe enough in the God who gave us the invitation to act on it? Two ways. When you get the invitation, it is God who is showing you how he believes in you. Because you're such a great person? No. Because of the relationship he can work through. The second one is what you believe about God. Yeah, lip service is a wonderful thing. But what will you do with the faith? Will you act on what you say you believe? Hebrews 11:6, we've got a word for that, don't we? But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. I believe enough to accept the invitation, and then I believe enough that God will follow through, and it will be glorious in whatever gets done in this. Experiencing God, this is what this is all about. And the thing is, once again, this doesn't settle for, okay, you super mature Christians, this is how we do it. This is one day Christian or a Christian for 100 years. It doesn't matter. If you want to experience God, this is how it works. You go into not a faith, a relationship with God, and then from the relationship with God, you act on the invitation. And as you're acting in the invitation, that's where you're experiencing God, which turns out in return to be the relationship altogether. If you're Ron number one who just goes and sits down and ignores the invitation, there is no experience. Where are we? Where are you? Where are we as a church? Do we even acknowledge the invitations? Do we even have enough discernment to see them? And if we do we go beyond the lip service? Do we actually act on the invitation? Whether it be huge or whether it be something that seems mundane just every day, both just as impossible unless God is there in it.